Welcome, Professor Frank Uekötter, if I pronounced correctly the surname. And thank you so much for accepting this invitation. So, just to introduce, we are at the University of Coimbra in Portugal to participate at the conference Monocultures, Eco-Culture Perspectives. I'm Rafael Shoa, researcher here in Coimbra at the Center for Social Studies and in the project Eco, Amazonian Plants and Animals, a project led by Dr. Patricia Vieira and supported by the European Research Council. So, as for Professor Frank, I just briefly, he's a professor of environmental humanities, but I would like to give you the opportunity to give more length into your home biography shortly, and then we go on your work afterwards.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah.
My name is Frank Uekötter. I teach environmental history and historyethnology at the Ruhr University Bochum in northwestern Germany. I came to Coimbra for this conference on monocultures, and that's actually something that I work on. But I think we'll come to that during this conversation.
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much. And I think one of the, of course, main one of the interesting things about your project and work broadly is that get my attention is the environmental humanities and environmental history field, right? So as I see, you graduated in history, political science, and social science, and that kind of mixed background. So I was really curious about how did the subject of environmental humanities and environmental history enter in your educational process, and I mean, was there something specific, perhaps in the US and German kind of context, academia, that somehow provided the background for this, or I don't know, how does that fit into your trajectory?
Well, you never know where your academic life leads you. The word environmental humanities wasn't around when I was at university. I did a classic history PhD on an environmental issue in the past, air pollution and how to deal with air pollution, and then kept working in history for a few years. But then I realized that the issues that we talked about as historical issues are also very much issues that are dealt with in the present. And what I recognize is that the way people talked about these problems mirror a lot of history. There's a lot of history in our environmental discourse. Now, there wasn't always. When environmentalism grew in the 1970s, it grew under the myth, we are new, we have no past, we don't have any legacy that we wrestle with, where we know now there was actually more history in it. And of course there are several layers of activism, political experiences, new technologies, new cultural tropes that are in play. All this resonates in our environmental thinking, but it's usually there in an unreflected, unrefined way. So I thought that, I found that all the issues that we talk about in history, we could also, by clarifying this, showing where do they come from, what are the interests that they reflect, what are the mindsets, all these classic humanities topics, they matter both for the environmental discourse and they matter as project history. So you have a confluence of interests between historians and the wider public, and I think that is where the environmental humanities come in, clarifying, contextualizing environmental debates, showing where they have a past, how experiences from earlier generations of activists, how they resonate in our time. So it's a bit of a clean-up job, a systemizing job, a clarifying job that we can do, and I recognize that that is actually a very good and very worthy goal for a scholar to work on issues that are in the minds of people. And of course, I didn't do that by myself. You may come to that point, but
yeah, of course.
Rachel Carson said it in the word. It's only this. Okay, good. I'll stop that.
Yeah. Well. Yeah. But yes. And how is there anything specific about places? I mean, U.S., German, or European context. How do you see the academic environment tackling these issues? Was that something specific in this context for making environmental humanities or environmental history something more needed or something to pursue? Is that?
Well, if you have worked in different places, I've studied in the US, I taught 10 years in Britain, now I live in Germany. You become very keen aware that there is only one planet, and you become aware of the interconnections between issues. But you also realize that the differences between different countries continue to matter. We are not, culturally speaking, on a flat planet. There are very significant differences in the environmental discourse between Britain, the United States, and Germany. So you always need to find ways to negotiate, on the one hand, the connectedness of environmental debates and environmental issues on the one hand, and the specific context, because exploring contexts and making clear where does a certain environmental conversation come from, that needs an awareness of what has happened within the nation state, that the nation state remains the most important political arena that we have. So highlighting these differences and highlighting the characteristics of each country is, I think, an important task. Being aware that we live in an age of interconnections.
Yes. And who, perhaps a very basic question for you also is, who were the key authors and books, let's say, in the field at the beginning of your career, and how do you view the development of the field in, I mean, very broad question, up until now, how and of course you can perhaps go from that and connect it to Rachel Carson's own context and how that developed afterwards in terms of theoretical landscapes and lines and books and how.
I'm a bit reluctant to identify founding people, because in many cases these were self-declared activists. In many cases they came with a lot of baggage from current political discussions and brought that to history. And a good part of my career, one of my first achievements, if you wish, in academia was looking at these activist-driven narratives and show that, well, history shows that things are more complex, more different. The past is a foreign country, and you can't just come with today's activist tropes and recognize them in the past. So we've had several generations of scholars now, and now advancing to mid-age myself, I'm becoming more respectful of the first generation, that they had the candor to start something like environmental history and envision there is a field like that. Because, well, historians in general have a tendency to look at the human sphere and be a bit disrespectful, negligent of all the non-human actors. Everything that does not use a language looks a little bit suspect to many historians, and bringing that into the field was a major achievement. But I like to think about environmental history as really kind of the constant reinvention of a field and renegotiation what it should be about and how we read it. There are marvelous books from the early years that we can still cite with pride as role models. Bill Cronin's Nature's Metropolis, on how Chicago evolved in interaction with its hinterland, and how environmental change out in the prairie was negotiated through Chicago and vice versa. That's now 30 years in print, still a stellar book that you can read and learn a lot, and a book that amazingly few scholars have followed, probably because it's such a great book. So there are these early influences, there are early models, but it's very much the recent research really has a new quality, also has a new reach. It's not coincidence that I cite a US book as one of the books that stand. Until 20 years ago, environmental history was very much a field with, well, there was North America, the US, there were some Western European countries, and they had some here and there, and that was it. And the field has really gone global over the last 20 years, and we have now high quality books on virtually every part of the planet. Of course, there's still more on the US than any other place on Earth. But at least we have a decent understanding of how environmental challenges look in Africa, in South Asia, in Latin America, and can better understand how, well, how there's a basis of similarities, but also the different experiences, different views, the different legacies that you have in different parts of the planet. So, as you know, I've written an environment history of the modern world in recent years that gives you a chance to really look at the literature in full. And it's really amazing how much of the literature that I've cited in this book is less than 20 years old. Because the field, the globalization of the field, also the reflection of the field is the methodological sophistication there is really a fundamental change over the last 20 years that take place.
Yeah.
I realized that when, as you mentioned, I'm one of the founding fathers of the Rachel Carson Center for Environmental Society in Munich, Germany, and that's where I really realized that we really have a more reflected, methodologically aware field. The big challenge was, well, how does all this fit together? And what I did in my environmental history is, well, what if it doesn't fit together? When it doesn't come together naturally, new paradigm, it's just messy and contradictory. And if you want to narrate this, that's what the overarching challenge or the overarching goal in this book. How do we, can we account for the global environmental challenges while acknowledging that the diversity around the globe is pretty enormous.
Yeah. Yes, that's pretty amazing. And I think you have introduced another aspect of the environmental history, which it's quite interesting on your own work, and which the notion of the globe. How do you see this environmental history emerging as a field in this whole conversation about what is the globe and how to conceptualize it and how to think environmental history and the global, and how do you see this battle, how do you solve, how do you synchronize these problems, and at what extent that is also part of the Rachel Carson project, when you is one of the founders of the centers, and how, is there any relation between the two projects, or no? What was the ambition of the center at the beginning?
Well, I can speak for the Rachel Carson Center because I left it in 2013. That's more than 10 years of development. And of course, as an ex-director, I was very keen to not interfere with the ongoing development of the center from the distance. That's always, the worst, the worst thing that you can do if you have run a center and then leave it, that you try to dictate what you do from abroad. But I think that was a vision that captured lots of people's minds, especially with the project that I did on environmental memories, where I made the case that a lot of our conversation about environment is shaped by memories of events, of places, of artifacts that have developed a certain aura. And I initiated a project on environmental sites of memory, inspired by the French tradition of the lieu de mémoire by Pierre Nora, that looked at a range of environmental issues. That was a very memorable project, a very lively project with a lot of support from students at Munich University, where we looked at how much of history and how the different layers of history shape our understanding. And we put up a website that still exists to this day. We had several collections that sort of make the case, where we need the environmental humanities, because that's always the question that comes up when we talk about what is it and what is it good for. Well, memories is something that we in the humanities are good at analyzing, and where scientists and engineers, the people who dominate our environmental discourse, are usually a bit clueless. How to deal with the past, how to deal with memories, how to understand how memories linger, how they change over time. These are things that I think people in the humanities can analyze with a great level of competence, and we provide people a service so that the next time that people come up with these monumental history memories, Rio taught us, or the Kyoto Protocol said so, that there are people around in the humanities who can offer a more refined, more reflective understanding of these memories, and thus give people the tools to handle them in a more sophisticated way, to get away from these monuments that taught us for all times how to do things, to we negotiate memory. We do it all the time, and if we do it anyway, maybe to do it in a bit more sophisticated way with more awareness of how memory operates.
Yeah, it's amazing. And I know that you have been thinking about this issue connected to the German history, right? So, I mean, could you give an overview of that? How does that went into practice on your own work?
You mean talking about
Memory and environmental history in this context.
Well, like many countries, we have a complete change of the environmental discourse post 1970. So you have new issues that come up, new modes of activism, new groups, new cultural tropes. There is an earlier past, also some unwholesome legacies from the Nazi era, but a lot of the conversation about what pollution is, how do you frame garbage problems, they were fundamentally transformed in the 70s and 80s. So these are really watershed years that you need to dissect and always inquire. You know, it's something that you negotiated in the old Federal Republic before unification. Is that still relevant? Does it still resonate? Is it still adequate in the 21st century? When we study environmental memories, it's not to conserve and praise and highlight. It's really to think, well, what was the use at the time? What were the effects? And then see, well, to what extent can we still make use of this? Or maybe we should think critically of these memories and take a different direction. So it's not a project that seeks to celebrate and fortify environmental memories, but encourage critical thinking about what is the legacy that we required.
That's great, and perhaps I'd go from that to your own engagement with what we give a name, but that people do that without giving a name. It's public history, right? So, and perhaps it's another interesting facet of your own work. And how do you conceptualize it? How do you see the importance of that, connecting memory, environmental history, global history, and public history? Yes.
Yeah, I think this is very much part of the big overarching project of bringing history into the public sphere. But what I'd like to highlight is, all these issues, they matter for our discourse on environmental issue beyond academia, but you can also write much more exciting, much more sophisticated histories in academic terms if you're aware of these contexts, because they warn you of these simple linear narratives where everything is, whether you know the good guys and the bad guys from the very beginning. Yes, sometimes you have good guys and bad guys, but very often it's a sea of gray hats, and finding ways to tell stories that are more nuanced, more multi-perspective. You can do that much better if you approach environmental memories and environmental humanities in this way. So there is a confluence of good history writing and good public history that I think we should tease out.
Yeah. Do you still have this channel called Chi, it seems?
Yep, that's it.
It stands for, was it?
Contemporary history.
Contemporary history, yes.
That was, it all started as a COVID improvisation when I was convener of the Contemporary History MA at that time in Birmingham, and we were forced into lockdown. We only saw our students via Zoom, and I thought you need to do something to have these corridor conversations. So I started with these videos. They, some of them actually went viral on an academic level. But there is a hunger for new perspectives and new insights and historically informed perspectives on our times. We live in a time of tremendous change, and that's often times where history is in demand. If there is a demand, why not meet it with academically trained historians rather than other people who are online. I started this contemporary history intervention with a lot of issues, not just environmental issues, so you could see me gravitate towards my field every once in a while. I started another video channel now that I'm in Bochum. Unfortunately, it's in German, at least for the moment. Maybe I might want to do something in English in the future. But of course, at the moment, my goal is to speak to people in Bochum, to broadcast what I do, and also one of the goals is to reach people at high school. So think about what will I study. Because truth be told, everything I talk about, how great environment history is and how sophisticated, there's still a lot of historians around who don't really take environment history seriously. And it's certainly not in the school curriculum. That's really a pity, because the great thing about teaching history in school, if you have history in school, it's the only opportunity in school to talk about the human as a whole. That's what I always like about teaching. It's not, it's not chemistry or physics or religion where you have one facet and explore that in depth, but you really have the whole human condition in play. And of course the environment needs to be a part of this human condition. It has always been, and will always be biological entities in addition to smart people. We're always connected to our environments, and bringing that into school. And that's why I started this video channel for people. Maybe, that's the way to reach people, that they look at what people do at the university, they see, oh, there is environmental history, I've never heard of that, let me see video, and in this way we become a normal part of history. So that, at least that's my hope, that if I retire one day, that people will no longer say you're an environmental historian, that people will say this was a great historian who just happened to work on some environmental issues, which is just, hopefully then a normal part of our understanding of the past.
Yeah, that's great. And perhaps also related to that is how in your experience that plays out with communicating or having conversation with natural scientists, as you said, who are usually the one who dominates the narrative on climate, but also with politicians, which are the one with real power in some sense. How does that play out in your own experience? Yeah. I'm assuming it's vast, but...
No, it's a very important question, because you should always respect scientific expertise. Always try to be aware of the latest scientific debates when it comes to climate change, when it comes to the living soil, when it comes to a plant growing, and we will come to a monoculture in a moment. There are so many things that scientists understand now that they didn't understand in the past, that you should be aware of. And everything that we do in history and the humanities is really a complement to that discussion. It's not about replacing or challenging the expertise, but to say, well, every science, every scientific expertise operates in a context. It has cultural baggage. It may reflect biases, male biases, Western biases, the biases of affluent societies, and it may do so in the most unconscious way. I talked yesterday about how our understanding of what a crisis means is very much shaped by the experience of the boom years that we've had in many Western countries, the 40s, 50s, 60s, when economies were expanding. There's a French equivalent of Trente Glorieuses, the three glorious decades of economic growth and social uplift. That experience resonates, and that has shaped our experience of what a crisis is, something you can bracket in spatially, chronologically, geographically, thematically. That's one of the things that you can highlight, well, maybe this understanding of crisis is the historical exception in a world of crisis management, of living with uncertainty, is historically the normal. And first, you bring that to scientists who come up with simple, very often, if you look at scientific expertise, there is an assumption of normalcy, of stability in their arguments. Looking at that and teasing that out is, I think, helpful, because it allows scientists to do better science if they're aware of the social, economic, political context that they operate in.
Yeah, that's great. And since we are on this broadening of the subject, let's go to monoculture. Mm-hmm. So now, how is it seems that is your also recent project, and how do you connect that with the previous questions on connection with other people and the problems that are associated with monoculture? What is the problem? What are the problems involved in this?
The problem is that we don't understand why we do monoculture. And I say that with a view to the agronomists, the scientists who tend to gloss over that fact. I assume, well, we live in a world of monoculture. That is what produces the lion's share of our food nowadays. That most of the food that we eat comes from producers who focus on one single commodity, be it soybeans, be it wheat, be it bananas. The world of agriculture is a world of specialized producers nowadays. Most people take that as a given. As a historian, you have the privilege of saying, wait, why are we doing this? And when you look at how people talk about monoculture, you see a lot of grievances, a lot of problems. But what you do not see is a clear rationale. My argument is monoculture is the greatest project of global modernity that we embark upon without a clear paradigm, without a clear, this is how it should ideally go. Because all the evidence, conceptual evidence, empirical evidence suggests this is a really bad idea. It gets you into all sorts of trouble. And I write the history of monoculture as a project that succeeded against all odds, but only because going through troubles, wrestling with crisis, improvising solutions for a time, this has allowed us to survive with many monocultures. We don't know whether that will continue. Maybe the stumble that we see in our time is the prelude to the ultimate fall of monoculture. Maybe in 50 or 100 years we'll talk about the history of monoculture as that brief moment where we tried this and failed, or maybe they'll stumble on for another century. We don't know. But writing a history that is really about managing and muddling through crisis, that's the overarching goal. And to bring that back into the conversation about agriculture, because if you can't explain something conceptually, why not try to explain it historically as something that we ended up with at the end of a long path with many small steps, many of which were protested, many of which were conflictual. There were many points where things could have gone in a different direction but didn't. And of course, once you talk about alternative paths, you realize that there are actually many options. We're not bound for monoculture for better or worse. That's just the game that we've come to play over global modernity. And but making aware this is it's a big project. It's a project that is rooted in many different places. A lot of people have put a lot of money, literally, into monocultures. So it's not something we can abandon on a whim, but we can deal with it with different levels of sophistication.
Yeah, that's right. And how do you see that? Staying with monoculture, how do you see that playing out explanations for difference between global north, global south, and Europe, the US, and the other parts of the globe? How does that fit into this conversation?
I'm eager to stress that the distinction between the global north and the global south really, monoculture isn't a project of any sphere of the world. It's really a truly global project. You can see this drift towards special production wherever you go in the modern world. It has something that's very deeply rooted in our understanding of divisions of labor, about how the capitalist economy should go. So the difference is that, well, the context is different. If you talk about the Green Revolution in the global south in the post 50s, 60s, this was a global event. We tend to think about this as something of the global south because the consequences for small producers were particularly dramatic. Or we have the same trend in the Western world, that many farmers gave up in the 50s, 60s, 70s, left the farm. An ongoing trend, to this day, that many farmers at some point decide, I'll give up. The difference is that in industrialized country, you had an urban job market where people could go and find decent jobs. And you had nation states that were able and willing to subsidize agricultural production. So there were means to cushion the transition away from agriculture in industrialized countries that just didn't exist in many parts of the global south. That's why the trajectory is very different here. So yes, there are differences, but it's not like monocultures work somewhere and they don't work somewhere else. It's really a global phenomenon, global troubles, and yes, that's the charm of doing projects in a global context, that you really start to recognize how similar these challenges are, and how similar responses are. Not identical, naturally. The commodities are different, places are different, but you can really see there is a baseline of similarities that we should be much more aware of, because it gets us away from these narratives. Oh, citrus trees in Florida are failing, or almond trees in Mallorca are no longer thrive, to understand that this is a general crisis of the project of monoculture that has been brewing for a long, long time.
Yeah. And how is that going? How is it going? The conversation with the broader public about this topic. I mean, going back to scientists and the politicians.
It's very much a conversation with stakeholders.
Okay.
Of course, there is the case for educating the consumer. I mean, the entire story of monoculture is a story about the complacency of the consumer, and for a good part of the time was just about people who couldn't afford any other food. Well, we now live in a world, at least in Western countries, where people can make better choices about their food, and often don't. So educating the consumer is a very big task, but others are doing that. That's not something I have to start. What I'm looking at is talking with stakeholders, talking with experts in the field, trying to address these people and to create a better awareness of their own roles, their own solutions, how they are part of a tradition of muddling through, and to center that discussion on what do individual people do, because that is something that I'm very eager to stress, the merits of an actor-centered approach, where it's really about understanding the mindsets of the people who work in monoculture, as opposed to looking from above and saying this is a monstrous project, they shouldn't be doing this, they should abandon this now. The critique of monoculture is long-standing. I don't have to invent that, but understanding the mind of people, and that's my hope at least. Write stories where people recognize that's something that resonates with me. I've been in a similar situation. Let's see how this played out then, and maybe become more self-reflective, more self-aware in my own time.
Okay, thank you. It's great. And so perhaps now we are kind of approaching the end, but I would like not to finish without you telling me a little bit about the Vortex. What is the Vortex? And tell me about this amazing project.
That's the world history that I mentioned, the environmental history of the modern world. I mentioned the basic idea, what if all the studies we have, all the globe, that's something I recognize the Rich Carson. We have tremendous work now for every part of the planet. No more black holes on our mental map of environmental history, but it doesn't fit together. And the eureka moment for me came when I thought, well, why not tell the story in a way where things do not come together, where they entangle, when they flow in different directions, when you have cross currents, when you have rough waters that you cannot easily decipher. And there you were with hydrological metaphors. I didn't start this watery thing with metaphors in history. Brodel started this with his idea of waves of history. So the vortex is in a way a play on this idea. Yes, there is such a thing like a flow of history. And the great thing about the vortex is it conveys the heft of the material. That there are material forces in motion that have a huge power that you ignore at your own peril. But also that a vortex is not something that it's not the bathtub kind of vortex that is neat and under control, but it's kind of a planetary sized vortex with a lot of turbulence, a lot of dynamism, and where you can see yourself navigating the vortex. And yes, of course, has this idea of an ultimate spectre of drowning. And yes, we're getting closer to the core where maneuvering room becomes very scant, but that's exactly the idea, to have a metaphor that allows for human agency, but also counts for the grace of God. There are huge limits to what we can do. And if you look at the flow of material that we consume on a daily basis, that's not going to stop anytime soon. We can navigate in a different way. We can maybe change the flow a little bit. But it's not a question of human will. It's really a question of understanding where we are. And if we imagine ourselves at the mercy and as people adrift in a giant vortex, maybe that is a metaphor to understand our own predicament and a recipe for writing exciting stories inside the vortex, because that's really what this book is about. Not just the bird's eye view, but it's a huge metaphor, but what does it mean to be inside the vortex and take or try to take responsible decisions? That's really what the book is about, to navigate an element where we are to a great extent really at the mercy of the elements.
Yeah, that's amazing. And perhaps a final thing would be, you have mentioned already some lines of it, but any hopes and fears for the future of not only the environment, but also the environmental humanities, field and how they come together?
About the environment, well, you have not met the only optimist around the world. I mean, it's a state of concern is, I think, something that, well, it's not something with the environment humanities. Everybody who engages and takes environmental issues seriously should be gravely concerned, but concern only gets you so far. You need awareness, and you need awareness of scientific results. You need awareness of the cultural, the political, the social context that we're in, and our environmental discourse is very science heavy. We know the results, we know where we need to get to. What we do not know is, well, what is the path that we need to take? And I have a hope that maybe the environmental humanities can make a difference in thinking through paths, thinking through options that we have, and in a way freeing people from this obsession, well, we need to go there, and it's such a long way to, well, people have always shaped the future of our planet. People always taken decisions in circumstances that were difficult, so maybe we can become a bit more sophisticated, more refined. There is a demand for environmental humanities out there. And the tricky thing is people don't know that they need us, but they do.
Okay, well, on that note, thank you so much for your time.